to just drop in, but let's kick off out of respect for people's time. So kia ora koutou, ko Tonkin and Taylor kai mahi aho, ko Simon Harvey toku ingoa, and welcome. I'm Simon Harvey from Tonkin and Taylor. Welcome to this webinar on transition planning and climate-related disclosures. Just like to ground things with a karakia to kick off.
Yes.
Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. Hei hiake ana te atākura, he tiu, he huka, hei ho hu, tihe, mauri ora. So let the winds blow from the west, let the winds blow from the south, let the breeze flow over the land, let the breeze flow over the ocean. Let the red-tipped dawn come with a sharpened air, a touch of frost, a promise of a glorious day. Behold, there is life. So kia ora everybody, I'm going to kick off today's proceedings on transition planning and climate-related disclosures. I'll then hand over to Ian Edwards, a climate risk management and strategic specialist from Informed.City with vast experience in business systems and processes, including many years working in the insurance and financial sectors. And then Ian will hand over to James Hughes, one of Tonkin and Taylor's most experienced technical experts in climate risk management and climate-related disclosures. And then we will leave some time for Q&A, hoping for at least 15 or 20 minutes at the end for some conversation and questions. But first up, what we would like to do is just run a quick poll to find out more about where you're all up to in your transition planning journeys. And that poll, which Katie will set up, will appear in the chat of the Teams call. So jump into the chat, Katie, I think if you're ready to launch that, and just choose the most applicable option now. I think there's 5 options, and we'll see where people are up to in their journeys. So Katie, if you could launch that. Does that come through? I can't see it. Here, Katie, either. Katie, are we able to do that?
Katie just says it's coming through in a minute.
Okay, all right. Well, you'll see that there'll be 5 different options from sort of just starting to already underway, and we just want you to pick which one you think is most applicable to you and your organization, just to get a bit of a sense of where different people are up to. And whilst we go through, just while we're waiting for that to come through, in terms of protocols, we are going to record the meeting today. And as we go through the presentation, please do put any questions or comments into the chat. And then what we'll do at the end is pick those questions. We'll see if we can find some synergies between them. And we'll dive into those questions at the end.
Might have a few tech issues there, Simon, with the poll.
Yeah. Oh, there we go.
Maybe
The poll, is the poll coming through? I can't see it again on mine, Casey, but if it's not going to work, let's not hold things up for that. Let's get cracking. James, I think you're going to launch the presentation.
I'll do that right now.
It's a good learning for us in the future. Okay, and James, if you can just make sure, there we go. That's the panel today. And thanks, James. So I'm going to start off today with the proposition that, here we go. The poll, I think, has just come up. Here we go. Let's get stuck into that. Just quickly, everybody, choose one of those options. And if you're just joining, we've just launched a poll in the chat. So just jump in, choose one of those 5 options, and we'll find out where the mood of the room is. So, and it looks an early indication is that people have either started and looking for guidance on where to from here, or they haven't started yet and are not quite sure how to move forwards. So keep popping that in. Let's carry on with the presentation. James, have you taken that away again? Here we go. So I'm going to start with the proposition that transition planning is not necessarily a new thing, and that companies and organizations have been doing this sort of planning all the time, though at different scales. And it's this sort of planning that drives change, innovation, and progress. And you'll see I've got a few bridges in my presentation because my simple brain thinks about transition planning as a bit like a bridge. And just as an example, let's take the Auckland Harbour Bridge, a bold, innovative, first of its kind in New Zealand, at least, project that connected communities to meet a growing city's needs. And fun fact, small digression just to start with, it was during the Harbour Bridge project that Ralph Tonkin and Tonkin Taylor, two young geotech engineers, first met. And that was the start of Tonkin and Taylor's story. See a smile from James. So, yeah, I think transition planning is a bit like building a bridge because it's complex, it's dynamic, and rarely a linear process. But it takes ambition, it takes vision, a clear plan, and a very well-organized team. And we're going to touch on all of those points today. But transition is not just about one project. To create a future that really addresses our sustainability challenges, it goes without saying, I think, that business models, products, and services must keep evolving. And I'm sure most on this call would agree that many of the business models we've inherited from the industrial revolutions, though groundbreaking in their own time, are now outdated and, well, unsustainable. So the need for transition, if we want to thrive long term, is inevitable. James, if we could just have the next slide, please. So one of my favorite Chinese proverbs is dig the well before you are thirsty. And I just think that's a great way to explain the idea of self-interested foresight. And whilst we know how to do business planning, what's new with transition planning is the need to align it with the climate reality, as well more broadly as with planetary boundaries and social equity, which are all fundamental conditions for sustainable systems. And the most immediate challenge for most businesses, and I think it's why so many people join this call, is going to be making transition planning in that sense more than just a compliance exercise for climate disclosures. And it's super important to recognize that the act of transition planning itself is a separate exercise to making the required disclosures. And this is actually made really clear, as you'll have read probably in the XRB terminology, which explains transition planning as just one aspect of a business's strategy. So transition planning really needs to line up with this bigger picture of organizational goals. And my part of this webinar is to quickly frame that up as the transition planning part of the equation. And I draw on my experience over the years, and what I found is that backcasting, which you can see a graphic of in this slide, is one of the simplest and most powerful techniques to facilitate transition planning discussions. And it particularly resonates well with boards and executive teams because it's an inherently strategic approach. And the difference highlighted by backcasting can be described as the difference between a jigsaw puzzle and a game of chess. So each of those has their own definitions of success, yet when you define success as a set of principles, like checkmate, rather than a fixed picture, like a jigsaw puzzle, chess allows a much greater degree of adaptability and flexibility to respond and achieve a set of goals in a more dynamic environment. So in a nutshell, this is what backcasting from sustainability principles is all about. And it's an approach that's been used for well over 30 years, so it's not new. And there's a bunch of strategic frameworks that people can use as tools to help facilitate that type of dialogue. And a couple might be the Natural Step or the Future Fit Business Benchmark as good examples, but there are others like B Corp, which can be used for this too, which provide a set of holistic or challenging measures that describe this future that we're looking for, which is aligned with truly sustainable success. And these sorts of tools can be really effective then to challenge your business model and your value proposition for resilience with a future focus over the longer term. So my first big point is this is not new, although in the climate context, I'm not saying it isn't really challenging, but there are tools and techniques like backcasting and strategic frameworks like Future Fit Business Benchmark that can help us do this in a way that lines up with where businesses want to get to shape their resilient and thriving future. The second point I want to move on to is more about integrated thinking as part of that exercise. And there's a good story, I think, that just highlights this. And the New Zealand company A2 Milk, when they replaced their boiler at the Matoda Valley milk plant in March this year, eliminated 22,000 tonnes of CO2 annually. And it's the first high pressure electrode boiler in New Zealand that's powered by 100% renewables delivered by Meridian Energy. And at a conference a year or so ago, the then Deputy Chair, Julia Hoare, highlighted how it was a nature-related risk assessment of the various options for that decarbonisation project that was a significant reason for not choosing the lower cost biofuel boiler option. And instead, the company took a longer-term view with a wider range of sustainability benefits, albeit at a higher initial capital cost. So the point I'm leading into here is that to take a really foresighted approach to risk management, climate transition plans need to be integrated in with other sustainability, transition and business planning. And I don't personally think this is controversial. It's referenced in all of the transition planning guides, but you do have to look pretty carefully for that. And if I have one gripe with the XRB and the IOD guides, it would be that this point hasn't actually been emphasized more, although it's mentioned in both of them briefly. So on the next slide, please, James, which we're already on. That's one there, the one with Ray Anderson on the top left. The other Chinese proverb that's my favorite is that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. And I like this one because it's all about good foresight. And yes, it's important to just get started and plant a tree, but trees grow big. And lots of people put big trees in the wrong place, which can waste years of growth when you end up cutting them down because they're in the way of something else or if they're dangerous. And having the vision and foresight to put the tree in the right place takes good planning. And most of you will be familiar with integrated thinking, which is the sister of IR or integrated reporting, now part of the IFRS family of resources. And a lot of New Zealand organizations use that approach because it helps them make decisions that factor in the full range of their material sustainability impacts. And again, most, if not all, companies required to make climate-related disclosures will have this list of their most material sustainability topics that they use for strategy and reporting. So my next big point here is that transition planning is the perfect time to put the full range of these material topics, ESG and sustainability issues, on the table so that the climate transition plan can be in sync with the other aspects of business's sustainability transition. And a great example of this is Interface Inc., which was led by Ray Anderson, who you see on this slide, with some of the performance metrics that he achieved through the transition planning work that they did. And they started in 1994. It was the first multinational industrial company to really tackle a complex transition planning exercise. And it was a natural evolution, if you like, of their business model, just based on delivering innovative flooring solutions for offices of the future. So they defined greenhouse gases as waste and then used a whole bunch of lean manufacturing approaches to eliminate that waste, with the early capital gains and savings being put towards more complex capital investments and process changes to keep the progress rolling. And amongst other tools, Interface was a big fan of biomimicry design principles that recreated their products in ways that supported life and living systems, so a much broader sustainability focus. And they changed their whole business model, from supply chain inputs using old fishing nets recovered from developing countries to designing new product lines and experimenting with new customer delivery models. And it's a truly inspiring story of industrial modernization, and just shows how an integrated thinking approach can lay the groundwork for really long-term commercial success. And just to finish this off, if you then think about the term carbon tunnel vision, which you probably all heard about, Interface intentionally avoided this by having 7 clear goals that underpinned their transition planning over the longer term. And they put these goals at the long-term definition of success and the guide for shorter-term investments then and changes, each supported by their own business case, one step at a time. And if we just look at the next slide, you'll see how this journey evolved over time, from the beginning in 1994 with a vision of essentially mission zero waste, which then in 2020 was realized that it wasn't enough. They needed to look beyond that, and then they looked at this more regenerative model. So their transition plan evolved over time. And the great thing about the story of Interface is that it's fully documented in detail in videos, case studies, and a couple of books. And this book here, Confessions of a Radical Industrialist, is, I think, now the perfect time as a Christmas gift to your executive team or board members, because it provides a really practical explanation of how Interface navigated the realities of this transition, how investments were evaluated, how challenges and failures were tackled, and how the company consistently innovated in its transition pathway. It's written by Ray, and it's incredibly insightful. So 4 main lessons, I think, from this, if we think about framing the transition planning discussion. 1, having a clearly defined vision that's broader than decarbonisation and climate is really important and valuable. Secondly, starting with the easier wins, reinvesting savings into tougher challenges that's aligned with that long-term vision drives consistent change on a journey. Thirdly, aligning the entire organisation with everyone playing their part is vital, and that's something Ian's going to cover in more detail. And fourthly, it's innovate or risk becoming obsolete or uncompetitive in this sustainable future. And as Ray Anderson famously said, compliance is not a vision. Well, transition planning isn't about compliance, but done well, it should enable compliance as a byproduct. So that's the framing. I'm going to hand over to Ian now to start to dig into some of those points in more detail. Ian, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I think you made some really salient points, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to dial it back a little bit. I'm going to take you through a definition of what climate transition planning is, and I think through that definition it's going to support a lot of what Simon has just said. So I mean, James, can we go to the next slide, please? And Simon's right. You know, transition planning has been around for a long time. It's not new. But in the climate space, it is challenging. And one of the reasons I would argue it's challenging is actually because of the predominance of guidance that has evolved over the last couple of years, which is essentially providing steps to support us plan our transition. But a lot of that guidance isn't consistent. So what I'm showing here through this very sort of rudimentary diagram here is just some of the guidance that's evolved recently. You've got Chapter 0, we've got the XRB, we've got the Transition Planning Task Force out of the UK, the CDP, the RBNZ, the TCFD, and on it goes. Now, I think that's important because a lot of people will turn to the guidance to help them through this journey. But I think what we can do is we can distill the major concepts from this guidance and actually come up with a definition of what a transition plan is. And I think that's really important to understand right from the start, because it sort of gives you an idea of, one, what you're trying to do, the scope of what you're incorporating, and the scale at which you're acting. So if we distill some of the major concepts, the common concepts, and some of what I would consider to be the more important concepts out of this guidance, you know, as Simon mentioned, you know, it's an aspect of overall strategy. But by the same token, you know, there is this expectation that it will be supported with, you know, time-bound actions. It is a plan after all. And it's all about, minimising your climate-related risk and maximising your opportunities, which can incorporate the likes of some form of decarbonisation, which might involve targets, and actually building your resilience to the physical elements of climate change. And the other thing is that is bounced around, and there is a little bit of debate around this, is the element of contribution of your plan or your steps or your final state around how your organisation contributes to the broader transition at a societal, regional, global scale. Because ultimately, climate change affects us all. The only way we're going to mitigate the risk is for all of us to act collaboratively. So if we can go to the next slide, please, James. And okay, here we are drawing a line in the sand. People may disagree with this or may not, and we can certainly discuss it later on. But look, the way we've defined a climate transition plan is it describes how an organisation's overall strategy will pivot its existing assets, operations, and business model to a climate resilient state that minimises climate-related risks and maximises climate-related opportunities. And it's supported by appropriately governed time-bound actions that both direct and evidence progress towards climate resilience in accordance with its climate-related ambition. Now, James is going to take you through climate-related ambition a little bit later on, but I thought I'd just sort of talk about climate resilience because that's sort of the state that we want to end up in. And that is, we go back to the IPCC. The IPCC defines climate resilience as a system's ability to anticipate, reduce, accommodate, and recover from disruptions in a timely, efficient, and fair manner. Now, you notice the word disruptions. It doesn't differentiate between, say, physical disruptions and economic disruptions or transition disruptions. It's all in the same bundle. And I think that's a really important way to look at your transition as you move forward. But you can expand that IPCC definition to extending the capacity of the entity to anticipate and grasp opportunities as they emerge. So it's, in other words, it's putting the organisation, the company, the entity, or whatever you want to call it, in the position where it can thrive in these new conditions. So what does this definition mean? James, you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. That's all right. There's a couple of things and really important points that come out of this, and a lot of these Simon has touched on, so I'm just going to reiterate them because they are really, really important. The first thing is, of course, is it's action orientated. It is a plan, and if we talk about smart action, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound, these are the guts of your plan. But the other important thing is it's not reliant on external events to enable the elements of the plan. So a classic example is, I do a heck of a lot of emissions reduction work. One of the things, and I do a lot of that for the banks, and one of the really constraining factors around emissions reduction is setting a baseline in the first instance, because data is poor, it's hard to find, and when you can find it, it's generally of poor quality. But it doesn't mean that you can't start moving on your journey. You can't use that as an excuse not to actually start decarbonising your organisation. What it means is, through your plan, you need to determine or come up with ways that you can work in data poor environments, or how you are going to support the evolution of that data and the quality of that data over time. So that's that action orientation and not being dependent on external events. The other thing, and Simon's mentioned this, is it's broader than decarbonisation. And I would argue that if you break your plan and your actions into mitigation over here and adaptation over here, that potentially you'll end up with suboptimal results. I mean, a classic example, very simple, is if I'm looking to plant trees to sequester carbon as part of my emission reduction strategy, which to sort of build some sort of offsetting or something like that. If I don't take into consideration the environment in which I'm growing those trees, it may well be over time that there will be deepening droughts, there will be elongated fire or wildfire or bushfire seasons. If I'm not taking that into consideration, which could impact the species that I plant, how I manage those risks, I could end up with all of my carbon credits going up in smoke. The other thing is, and Simon mentioned this, and look, I agree 100%. This to me is the guts of what we are trying to achieve through the transition process. It's integration. It's integration of climate into the overall strategy, but across all of your decision-making functions. So that to me is really, it's an integration exercise. And look, if you don't believe me, and if you want to point to some guidance that supports this, I mean, Simon mentioned that it's not particularly mentioned in the XRB. But if you go back to the TCFD, the 2017 recommendations and the implementation recommendations, do a word search on integration. It's all about integration. The next thing is risk and opportunity focus. What are the actions that we can take to mitigate future risk and position ourselves to grasp opportunities? How do we build the flexibility and redundancy in our systems, if required, to allow us to thrive in these changing environments? So that's a really important element. And the last one is this systems focus. It's in your plan and what you're looking to achieve. It's considering, the interactions of a rapidly changing world, between the company, the broader economy, society, and environment, any dependencies that world creates for your organisation, and how those dependencies may change over time. And as I mentioned before, more broadly, it's around, okay, how can my organisation contribute to that bigger picture? Because ultimately, it's in my interest to do that. So these are 5 important aspects of I would assert 5 important aspects of a climate transition plan. Now, thanks, James. You moved that quickly, so I guess I'm running out of time, so I'll be as quick as I can. There were just 3 other things I wanted you to consider, or I wanted to raise as considerations as you're starting to develop your plan. And that's, in the first instance, these concepts of just transition and do no significant harm. The just transition is around the elements of the impacts of your transition on employees, on communities, on society, and really trying to minimise any negative impacts, and actually, ideally, through your transition process and through your end state, actually leave those employees and those societies in a better state than where they began. And then there's this concept of do no significant harm, which is very similar, but it's more applied to the broader consideration of the environment. And a classic example, once again, quite simplistic, is I'm looking to build a dam so that I can generate hydroelectricity, low emissions electricity. But in building that dam, I'm going to flood a valley full of endemic wildlife, and I'm going to displace a significant number of people. I mean, that's hardly a positive outcome. And that sort of goes back to what Simon was saying also around that broader view through your transition plan. And of course, you can apply a risk lens to this. Why would you do this? If you're not taking just transition into consideration, if you're not taking do no significant harm into consideration, you're potentially exposing yourself to reputational risk, you're potentially exposing yourself to litigation risk, and you could lose your social licence to operate. And then the last thing is a credible transition and a credible transition plan. And I raise this because I do a lot of work for banks, and I know that this is something that's being considered on a regular basis, where banks set their targets, and of course their targets can only be met if their clients meet their targets. And one way to determine whether a client is meeting an emissions reduction target or a resilience target along those sorts of lines is, do they have a transition plan? But it's not enough to just provide a piece of paper with a couple of scribbles about, we'll do this and we'll do that. What banks and financiers and investors want to know is that it's credible. And the way that this is defined is largely, is it built on solid foundations, and are there tangible actions that support the plan and the implementation. And the last thing, and I didn't put it up there, is are these disclosed and reported in a transparent way? So these are three considerations that you might want to think about as you start to design your plan. But look, I've taken enough time. I will pass it over to James. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Ian. So I'll just apologise for my voice. I've lost it, and I'm transitioning from having very little voice to probably having no voice by the end of this presentation. So bear with me. I've got a few slides that's going to focus more on the practical approaches to transition planning. And hopefully this is helpful for those people who are beginning or partway through their work in this area, and we really appreciate some discussion on this when we get to the end. So first up, just to remind people what the standards say, and Ian sort of covered this at a high level, but the transition plan is an aspect of an entity's overall strategy that describes the targets, including any interim targets and actions for its transition to a low emissions, climate resilient future. And there are the actual disclosure requirements there, which I won't read out. We've modified this diagram that originally came from the Transition Plan Task Force that we think sets out a clear and simple way to approach this. So 4 steps: from assess, set your ambition, plan your actions, and implement those. We've added here in the middle this loop, if you like, of a business case. And it's really important here to sort of, I guess, check back on your level of ambition in relation to the feasibility, timing, cost, etc. of those. So that's why this business case piece we think is really important. And I've also added the consideration of flexible actions there as well, and I'll talk a bit more about that when we come to talking about dynamic adaptive pathways, for example. So the questions we want to ask is, what will you do and when? What will you do right now? How will you adapt as things emerge over time? And this is effectively a project, a transition plan. So it needs to be well governed. You need to have oversight and accountability, as well as the responsibility for delivering these transition plan projects. And the last point I want to make is each transition plan will be very bespoke to each organization, depending on the nature, the type of industry and sector that you work in. So I've set out those same 4 steps in this diagram. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 across the top. And I just want to talk about some elements underneath each of those. And I'll read from the bottom up. So understand, firstly, your dependencies when you're setting this project up. Measure your emissions, understand your emissions profile. Assess your climate-related risks and opportunities. All of you will have done this, but it's important to document this. Then engage the board and ensure that there's cross-company ownership. And I think this is an important point to just pause on, because this is where you could, I guess, commence a broader conversation to ensure that you're not missing opportunities that might emerge through a more collaborative approach, potentially at a sectoral level, for example. So how can, this isn't an individual business problem, this is a national and international problem. So how can we look outside our organizations for opportunities to collaborate? And linking back to what Simon, I suppose, and Ian was saying, review your broader sustainability strategy goals and material issues when you set this up. Your ambition is really important. And so this is about confirming at the bottom there your highest priority climate risks and opportunities, confirming your targets for decarbonisation and climate risk management. How ambitious do you want to be? And so that ambition is going to be around your breadth of your ambition. Is it just climate focused, or are you going to think more broadly? And what is the pace and scale of that ambition over time? Into your actions, and again, reading bottom upwards, you might have actions to proactively respond to climate opportunities, actions to respond to transition risks, your decarbonisation actions, and then more broadly, they might feed into broader business model considerations. And then, as I mentioned earlier, this important step around merging that into a business case, and that might cause you to go back and reconsider your ambition, either increase it or moderate it, or think about how it evolves over time. And lastly, implementation. At the bottom, identify any quick wins, finalize your business case, and importantly, we'll talk a bit more about this, but we're often in a situation of deep uncertainty. So how can we have processes that build in flexibility, or at least communicate thinking about these things and we're thinking about the uncertainty in our decisions. And flexible pathways or dynamic pathways are potentially a tool we can use. So some core elements, and this is breaking it down even further. So your transition plan actions fall within probably two core pieces, and then there's a third one. So we've got decarbonisation in number one, responding to climate-related risks and opportunities. And then there's this third one, which is contributing to an economy-wide transition. And that's, we think, is likely to emerge over time. But interestingly, talking to people from certain sectors like the energy sector and even the telco sector, this is, you know, core to their business and what they do, supporting and driving the transition at an economy-wide level, both for both those sectors. So this is an important story and attribute, I suppose, of those organisations, and I imagine many others that you might want to highlight and build on over time. And then underneath, we've captured that changes within the business model, and I'll talk a little bit about each of these. I'll just give you 15 seconds to read this because I think it's really important. So I'll just pause. This is around ambition. So I'll just give people time to read that. So, you know, I think this really sets out the ambition context and statements really well. The points I'd make here is reflecting the urgency to act. So we were talking about this earlier, but every day we see, I guess, new statistics or new interpretations of the situation that we're in. I read yesterday that the Copernicus Institute have suggested we'll reach 1.5 and surpass it on a global average basis from around 2030. And 2024 is looking to be the hottest year on record. So things are urgent, and depending on which climate scientists you listen to in terms of the carbon budgets, you know, the percentage reduction per year globally could be upwards of 10%. Kevin Anderson would say it's 19%. So massive, massive challenges. So I think that's the first part around the urgency. The second part at the bottom there, I think, is the bespoke nature of the organisation and the sector that you operate in. So you'll have very different objectives and priorities in terms for each organisation. So now I just want to touch on briefly some points on decarbonisation and then some points around the adaptation, if you like, or the responding to uncertainty. So we do a lot of work in this area around marginal abatement cost curves and emissions pathways, and I'll just explain how they're useful. So first up, the marginal abatement cost curves we think are really useful tools to understand the cost per tonne abated for different emissions reductions initiatives that you might develop for your organisation. And they're really good ways to communicate that as well. Whether you do it in a curve basis like this or whether you just do the analysis is another thing. It's not a precise science, and it's important to note that the marginal abatement analysis isn't a business case. It serves to help prioritise which of those initiatives you want to focus on, but it doesn't remove the need to go and do a more detailed business case for those ones that you want to take forward. I think it's also useful to mention to group your initiatives into different categories. We often group them into bucket one, which are those initiatives that might be quote unquote non-feasible currently, unlikely to yield high emissions reductions, technology mightn't be there or unclear on the technology, or financially infeasible. So those are ones you might want to park and look at later in the future. You've then got a bucket which are difficult to quantify because they're very uncertain around the ability to reduce. For example, behaviour change might fall into that. Those are ones you might want to implement anyway, but you might not want to spend a lot of time quantifying. And that leaves the third bucket, which are the ones you want to focus on and put more effort into that are feasible. So that's the marginal abatement cost curves. We find them really useful. The second point is having a way to present, assess your emissions reduction pathways. And this is just an example, but they're really useful, these types of analysis, to compare the options you developed against the targets that you've set. In this example, you can see the targets aren't actually met, so there's a gap there. So you might, and presents a certain message, right, for this organisation that they're not quite meeting the targets that they've set and they need to do more. Typically, you would take a range of initiatives forward and analyze those in more detail and use these two tools, which we find really useful. So that's one sort of tip and piece of, I suppose, advice around the decarbonisation piece. Now, on the adaptation side, there's and your resilience or adaptation responses, whether they're to physical or transition risks, there's deep uncertainty, and that's evidenced by the projections that we're all well aware of. We could follow a high emission scenario in SSP5 or SSP3 future. We could also, if we're lucky and the global community changes at pace, we could follow a scenario where we decarbonise rapidly in SSP1 type future. There's massive uncertainty around this. So how do you prepare? How do you plan in a world where you really don't know, in many cases, what the future might hold? For some actions, there you will be able to fund and implement those, and they'll be quick wins or no regrets. Or you might be in a situation of high risk that you go, we've got to fund this, and there's not really any question about it. But for others that are emergent over time, there are some tools that we think are helpful, and that comes, many of you might be aware of, flexible or dynamic adaptive pathways. And while these don't give you a solution, they serve, I think, to help communicate the thinking you've done, the options you've assessed, and importantly, how long those options might be useful for, and when those thresholds for those options might be surpassed over time. So what this means is you might have option A, B, C, or D. Each of those might last for different durations of time. And this yellow one, for example, doesn't go very far at all. And you need to identify what triggers, and they might be environmental triggers, would cause you to move to a different pathway. For example, if your building is flooded, there was potential risk from flooding, you might say, when we have flooded twice in a 5-year period, we have determined that will be our trigger to implement or move to a predetermined option C or whatever it might be. So those are useful pathways, I think, where you've got large uncertainty to think about and communicate those, and you can also attribute costs and benefits and co-benefits to those as well. Just briefly, moving to that, if you recall the diagram, it had the layer at the bottom around how we think about broader changes to our business model. And one way to think about this is your core business model in the middle and the changes that might be related both upstream and downstream to that. So starting with the upstream, there could be entering new supply chains or supply chain agreements for different products or inputs into your business, or changes in the geographical reach of those. Your core business model really relates to the conversation we've been having around decarbonisation, around building resilience, but it also might mean at the bottom there, creation, contraction, or changes in different markets, or changes in the channels or methods of customer interaction. So you've got your core business model considerations, and then lastly on the downstream side, relating to your customers, your products or your services offered, or changes in those downstream supply chains or potentially markets or locations. So I think it's a nice way to think about the broader business model that elevates the discussion from, say, a granular level up to the more foundational components of the business and how it operates. And then lastly, and Ian touched on this before we finish and open up for questions, there are some synergies and conflicts between mitigation and adaptation. I won't go through all of these, but it's important to note. And in the middle of this diagram, you've got the win-wins, where you've got strong benefit for adaptation and mitigation, if you like. On the left, you've got adaptation with trade-offs or consequences for mitigation, and on the right, you've got mitigation with consequences or trade-offs for adaptation. So an example at the top on the left is where you are adapting by installing more air conditioning due to heat, but that obviously results in more energy demand. And on the right, you might say you're investing from a mitigation perspective in hydrogen production, but that might have a trade-off with water availability and for periods of drought. So again, important note there for those trade-offs that you need to consider. That's all I had, and Simon, I'm going to pass back to you to sort of look at some of the questions and open things up for discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Thank you, James. And look, thanks, James. Thank you, Ian, for your input. James, we're going to flick onto that last slide. Here we go. So we've got a few things here that were our thoughts, but we've got a few questions come through. And James, just because of what's most fresh in people's mind, I'm just going to come back to you quickly. Do you have a good example of a dynamic adaptive policy pathway that's been applied in a strategy context? So what we've got here, not like a physical stock bank or beach nourishment type of action.
Look, I've seen them applied in many different contexts. In fact, Tonkin and Taylor have been using them almost internally for some strategic decisions, not in the climate context. So I think, and I've also seen them referenced from the NGFS as well, in terms of thinking about dynamism, if you like, and at a more sort of economy-wide level. I think you can apply the concepts in any context. It's about having those options. I think it might nicely apply to transition risks where the policy environment, for example, is very uncertain. Most of the examples I've seen have been in the physical environment, either at a community level or at a specific asset level. So might have to come back to that and dig out any examples that are more strategic or transition related. But I definitely think there's application there.
Thank you, and certainly I think it's one of those areas where people can, in lining up with one of our comments there, is where people can use their scenario analysis to think about what the different options might be along those pathways, right?
Right.
Let's go to a question back from Alison. Actually, I had Alison. I just asked Alison's question. Let's go to a question from Sophie, which I think is for Ian. Can you please talk about the relationship between entity level risk assessments and transition planning? And let's keep the answers as short as we can, and then we'll try and get through all of these questions. But over to you, Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Keep it as short as you can with something as complex as that. So the question is entity level risk management versus transition planning, if I understand. Look, I think the entity level risk management, the results of that risk management process are one of the drivers of the actions in your transition plan. I mean, ultimately, what you're looking to do, through the process, of course, as I mentioned, is reduce your exposure to the risks and maximise your exposure to your opportunities. So a good starting point is actually understanding, what your current exposure is. Now that's going to change over time, but it can certainly, with your transition plan, a risk management assessment is actually critical in helping you prioritise, what you do in what order, and essentially, what your transition or your final state actually looks like. Because I mainly come from a finance perspective, I'm not so involved in the capital or the allocation of monies towards big capital items that I actually own. So I look at things from a process perspective, and what you need and the considerations you require through your processes to ensure that you are considering these risks in the decisions of your banking and your financing capital allocations, for example. So risk management, any level risk management is absolutely critical. The scope of entity risk management to climate is very, very broad and systems orientated. And I would argue the more that you can consider through your risks to identify those cascading, those compounding elements, the more effective your risk management assessment will be. But that will then drive, as I mentioned, the prioritisation and the actions that will fulfil your transition plan. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. That's great. And the one here we can pick up pretty quickly from Sierra. What were the four sort of conclusions from the interface story? And I certainly recommend read the book. They're all in there. But number 2 was start with easy wins, which James covered, so that you can save some money to reinvest into sort of capital expenditure and process changes. Third one was align the entire organization, which Ian talked about a little bit. This needs to be in everybody's decision making. And the fourth one was about innovation to avoid risking obsolescence. So that's that one. And then there's 2 more questions that we picked up here from Brad and Liz about the disclosures themselves. And I think we covered this and this is, I think, one of the areas is where there's some confusion, is that the transition planning exercise itself should lead to the good disclosures, and then the disclosures are governed, as James said, by what the XRB has actually asked for. But the transition planning exercise is something that where the business should be thinking about its long-term future. So therefore is part of the business strategy. Again, the interface story and our other stories are really good ones about how do you do that. And I think that maybe we can come back to a question, tie that into another question about the lawyers. Yes, we know a lot of legal firms are getting really involved in this because boards are very, very nervous. But that relates to the disclosure part of it, and particularly things like forward-looking statements. So that's probably a question for a seminar that we can that you might have from Chapman Tripp or one of the other legal firms. But what I would like to tie it back to for James, I think, here is then what do you do if you don't yet have certainty around data? And this was our first bullet point. So, for example, if you haven't baselined your Scope 3 emissions, and this goes to one of the questions that came through from Mary, how do you work with that if you've got these sort of data limitations or don't have a full set of data, things like Scope 3? How do you work them with the transition planning process? James, any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I mean, my simple response to that is both for physical data and the emissions data is I think you need to do the two things in parallel. I think we can't wait for data. I think we need to start developing, investing, driving emissions down, both Scope 1 and 2, and then into our value chains, our supply chains. The data, we need to do that in parallel and try and get actual data or spend-based data and improve that. The same on the physical side. Look, we constantly, I feel, using the board data as a bit of a crutch to not do anything. New Zealand has poor flood data, but there's in various other climate variables, we know we're never going to have perfect data, but I don't think that stops us from developing and implementing actions. So, yeah.
Okay,
can I provide a comment there, Simon?
Please.
Yeah, just with the paucity of data in the emissions space. I mean, I actually sit on the Science-Based Targets Initiative. There is expert advisory group for the financial institutions, and if you go and look at the consultation document of what's called the Financial Institutions Net Zero Consultation Document, you'll notice that there's a shift away in the first instance due to a lack of data around actually quantifying emissions and focusing far more on alignment actions. And as I say, from a bank's perspective, categorising your customers by the degree or the position of their alignment journey that they are currently at. And that flows on to something else which was asked around the disclosure. The disclosure requirements for the XRB are relatively high level, but I would argue that if you're looking for finance or investment or a loan or whatever, what you really want to focus on is disclosing and showing that you have a credible transition plan. Because as I say with the SBTI, one of the ways to categorise an organisation as transitioning, for example, is to look at that organisation and say, have you got a credible transition plan? And if you set your governance up, via your relevant reporting lines and all that sort of stuff, that will all just fall out and become quite a simple exercise. But it's something really worth thinking about, that extra granularity beyond what the XRB require, because you have got specific stakeholders who are going to be looking for more.
Thank you, Ian. We've got a couple of questions here as well that hone in on this question of ambition and targets, and the potential tension between describing what an organizational business might look like in a sustainable future and backcasting from that versus what people can see as achievable and realistic today. And I know, this is often one of those questions that gets tied up in the conversation around the level of leadership required in this area and the sort of personality of particular businesses in terms of how ambitious they are and the sort of objectives they might set. But then obviously when we come down to the disclosures, then we get this nervousness from boards and organizations, executive teams, particularly boards, because of the personal responsibility and forward-looking statements about how much they're prepared to put in writing in terms of this and for their disclosure. So again, we're distinguishing between the planning process and the disclosures. But any thoughts there? Let's go to you first, James, in terms of that tension between, sort of what's required of businesses to aim for a sustainable transformation of their business versus the reality of what's achievable and what should be going into their disclosures.
This is the question, right? For me, goes to the heart of a business and the economic system, and I'm not going to go there in that depth, but I think this is, at what point does an organization make a decision to set down an ambitious trajectory and then come to the realization that that is unaffordable, or that will basically make that business quickly or over time unprofitable, etc. So this, this is a kind of foundational question, and we will see this play out over, this is my view, and Ian, you'll have yours, but over the next 10 years, this goes to the heart of many the conversations that we will need to have, and people are going to have to ask themselves pretty hard questions at business levels, and goes back to that urgency, that ambition around the state of the climate and the state of the environment and the broader planet. So I don't have an answer to that, but that's the tightrope we're walking. Ian.
Thanks, James, and you're being invited to go there, but let's go to Ian very quickly, and perhaps then we can start to close things up.
My recommendation would be, and this is based on actually not so much transition planning, but in a previous life, I spent a lot of time building business information systems and whatnot. And one of the things I would strongly recommend is, with your transition planning, blue sky it. Go basically document what a climate resilient state looks for your organisation. Do that in the first instance. Then work back. Then ask those commerciality questions, right? Because then what you'll see is what is commercial, what is in at this particular point in time, because things will change over time. We know that, and that's part of the challenge with transition planning. What is in and what is out, and why is it out? The other thing is, if you start from a position of commerciality, you'll end up with a 15% solution. If you start with a position of blue sky, you'll end up potentially with a 40-50% solution. So I would go for the optimum solution document what that looks like for you, then take the commerciality decisions and work backwards.
Thank you, Ian. And just to sort of close things down, because this goes to another point as well, as about being reliant on other actors where you feel there's a technology or policy that's required for your business and able to make further progress, being reliant on other actors, is that when you, certainly in the work that I've done in the strategy area here, that enabling executive teams and boards to do that sort of challenging process, and things, as I say, like the Future Fit Business Benchmark are excellent, because they set out a set of performance metrics that describe this is what your business would need to achieve in order to address all of its sustainability issues. And as you work back from that, not to say that you're going to get there in a day, but you start to identify those areas where there are big gaps or innovations required. And that's why I come back to Ray Anderson's book. It is such a practical explanation by him of how those challenges were addressed over many years. And it's been a 30-year journey for that business. It's very empowering for executives to hear that from another CEO, their personal experience of how they did it step by step and actually made it work commercially. So I go back to that. Going to tie things up now. We've got, James, one more slide just to let people know that we've got a few more webinars coming up in this series. As Marta said, we'll dive into the data issue a little bit more in the next one. So if you're interested in that, particularly around Scope 3 decarbonisation data, that'll be a really useful session there. And then we close things off for this year on the 4th of December. And first one's on the 29th of November. 4th of December, we look more specifically at assessing the financial impacts and what that means. So we've got Ian and James back for that one. So look, thank you very much indeed for joining. We will share the recording, I think. I think we covered most of the questions, but we've got a note of them, and you're all welcome, of course, to get in touch with us if there's anything else you'd like to discuss, or if you have some other questions to raise. But just to close things down, I will just a very short karakia whakamutanga to close things off. Kia tau ngā manaakitanga a te mea nui. ki runga, ki raro, ki roto, ki wahu. Kia tutu ngā mahi katoa, haumie, huie, tai kie.
Yeah.
May the blessings of the great be with us, above, below, within, and all around. May all our endeavours be upheld, joined together, connected, and unified. Many thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, James. Thank you, Ian. And thanks
everyone.
Molly and Katie, for making it all come together. Kia ora.
Thanks, guys.